Welcome everybody this evening to this wonderful event. I am Eloise Scotford. I'm the Dean of the Faculty. I'm co-director of the Centre for Law and Environment and a Professor of Environmental Law. I have a really easy job, which is to say welcome and to hand over to those who did the hard work organising tonight's event. But I did just want to reflect on something quickly before I did that, which is we have this very precious centre at UCL, the Centre for Law and Environment, which has was one of the first such centres in a law school in the United Kingdom and has gone from strength to strength. And we have various strands to what we do. We do a lot of teaching, and I see some of our wonderful students here. We have a great master's programme, which has an environmental law specialism. We do lots of great research, and I see a number of my colleagues here, one of whom is chairing tonight's, or two of whom will be chairing tonight's panels. But we inevitably, because of the nature of the subject matter, which is dealing with environmental problems, do a lot of external engagement work. And tonight is a good example of that. And we have a lot of partners, stakeholders, friends that are part of our centre and our community. We have one of our honorary professors on the panel tonight. And we never have enough time for this work because of the nature of the issues we are dealing with. Emma Blackman, thank you, our events manager who has organised tonight, says, your centre is just so busy. Well, that's because the world is demanding that we talk about these issues. And so it really is my pleasure tonight to welcome you and also to hand over to the brains behind tonight's event, which is from our, not new, but this year, a new appointment in lecture in finance and financial law and environmental law. And that is a post that we very deliberately created as a strategic priority in the faculty. We thought we shouldn't be thinking about finance in a siloed world and climate and environment in a siloed world. That's not what's happening in the real world. And we need to build up teaching and scholarship around the interconnections between finance and environment. And it's been such a, I think, a great thing for us as a faculty to create that kind of post, but also to have Pedro as our new colleague. So I will hand over now to Dr. Pedro Schilling de Carvalho to introduce you to tonight's event. We have a packed agenda. There will be refreshments at the end to reward you for your stamina, and I think a short break in the middle to make sure we all keep paying attention. With that, I hand over to you, Pedro.
Thank you very much, Eloise. Thank you very much, Eloise. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much to my panelists as well. We're very excited to try to do a bit of the briefing of what was a pretty packed COP. That's why we went with two panels. This first panel will focus on climate finance and climate finance related aspects. I'm very, very happy with the stellar lineup we have today, starting with Veselina Vessi-Haralampieva, who is an associate director and senior sustainability counsel at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, has been doing some of the most, I'd say, innovative things in the space of multilateral development banks and beyond. So very, very glad to have you. We have Alex Lombos, who is an accountable finance lawyer at Client Earth, and who I'm very happy to also introduce as the lead for our UCL Client Earth Transition Finance Research Clinic, which is kickstarting tomorrow. We're very excited about that as well. We have joining virtually Dr. Nathan Derry-Basselier, who is the director of the Erasmus Platform for Sustainable Value Creation at the Rotterdam School of Management. Did wonderful, wonderful things previously as director of the EU Sustainable Finance Initiative, some of the best events, and during the pandemic on top of that as well. And we have our own Professor Jeff Twentyman, honorary professor at UCL Faculty of Laws, senior consultant at Slaughter and May, former head of sustainability for Slaughter and May as well, and wearing multiple other hats as well, which hopefully will contribute to this discussion. The way the discussion will work, we have 3 rounds of questions. We're starting with developments at the international level to try to reflect on what COP has achieved or has failed to achieve. We're then moving in the second round to developments at the national level. International commitments, international aspirations need to be translated to action at the national and local level. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. And then we're going to finish with a round reflection on next steps, challenges, and templates that might need more attention going forwards as well. We're going to try to have a Q&A. That depends, again, on, we have a pretty packed panel, which was an attempt to bring perspectives from multiple stakeholders. If that's not possible, as Eloise mentioned, we do have a reception at the end. So hopefully any burning questions that don't make it during the panel, we can discuss afterwards with over drinks and foods. So with that, I think we can kickstart our discussions at the international level, at the COP level. So we had a pretty busy COP, both in terms of issues related to COP, such as the global stocktake, but also because of developments that were happening in the sidelines of COP, involving many other stakeholders that were there, private sector, multilateral development banks, NGOs, civil society, and so on. So my first question to our panelists today is, what would you single out as the most relevant developments that we had in December in your respective fields, as well as the area that still requires more attention or has more frictions in the current moments? I think we can start with Vessi.
Yes, thank you, Pedro, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to Pedro, Eloise, and UCL for the invitation. I'll just start by going back to what you said, that dealing with climate, it's such a complex issue, right? So it's difficult to dissect and focus only on one particular issue. But you're right in saying that this was an important COP. It really was focused on the stocktake. It was focused on the implementation of the Paris Agreement. But also from our side, as I work at the Multilateral Development Bank, it was important to see what has been the progress of the commitments made by the non-state actors. So these are, in our case, the financial community, businesses, and the multilateral development institutions. And at the same time, what I just want to say quite briefly on kind of more international, and personal stocktake is that now, like a couple of months after the COP, kind of all realized that last year was a year where global emissions peaked, yet another year. Yeah. So this really makes us all realize that all the not even relying necessarily on some of the detailed analysis by IPCC, but ultimately the progress on the emission reduction plans on the national level have been quite deficient. At the same time, because we work with the public sector and the private sector, what we have realized is this lack of ambition and also very strong lobby from the fossil fuel industry and others have slowed down the ambition from the private sector. At the same time, we very much remain, as a financial institutions, very much remain bound by the targets that we have set. And for MDBs, this is alignment with Paris. So we set a target in 2017 as a group of multilateral development banks that by 2030 we will align with Paris, and we will have eventually all our operations aligned. So what I just wanted to highlight a few things from our side. Last year was we from EBRD were the first MDB that aligned with Paris as of 1st of January 2023. That meant that we have worked on methodologies, we have worked on transition planning for us as an institution, but also for our investments, for the private sector businesses, both in the corporate and the financial institution side, equity, funds. So you mentioned that we've been working on some of the innovative products in the MDB world, and that's indeed the case, because today actually we had a couple of days a meeting of IFIs here in London to discuss what's the progress made on our Paris alignment commitments and how do we translate that in the investment that we make in the regions, in the country's operations, right? How do we achieve the systemic impact of this kind of business transformation from our clients? So the approach that EBRD has taken, which is very much looking beyond use of proceeds. So this is not focusing on where our investment goes, but on our clients, so on the corporation, on the financial institutions, on the markets, in order to achieve this systemic impact, has so far been, I would say, a pioneer amongst other RFIs. And ultimately, this means that in addition to working with the private sector, we engage in policy reform, we engage in discussions with regulators, we nudge national governments to phase out fossil fuels, but also to have ambitious climate targets, which now the challenge for us next year is to introduce just transition, nature, and some of the other sustainability risks. So I will stop because I know we have little time, but we can continue in the Q&A session.
Great, thank you very much, Vessi. Jeff, maybe you want to chip in?
Thank you, Pedro, and thank you everyone for doing it. I'm just to clarify, you said, Pedro, in your field, and I did have to pause to think what was my field. I'm not an academic, but my time has been spent advising businesses. So I'm trying to look at this from the perspective of what do businesses, which is a significant part of the category of non-state actors, what do they take from this? And businesses don't operate in a vacuum. And if you like, the sort of big, messy, multi-dimensional sort of confluence of needs and vested interests and politics and geography that is COP creates an environment, no pun intended, in which businesses have to operate. And so, what do you take from something like COP? And I think what you have to take, and this is a very obvious point, is that it's the beginning of the end for the fossil fuel economy. It's quite late to be beginning something, but it is the beginning of the end. And that has an enormous knock-on effect throughout the world. And we can debate probably on another panel, because we haven't got time to talk about the lateness of all of this happening. But it is happening. You can't look at the fossil fuel industry and think that they have indefinite longevity as a result of this COP. And lots of other themes also were surfaced and connections were made. So, there was some progress made on adaptation and resilience. The importance of nature as part of the climate issue was recognised. Huge number of sectoral initiatives, whether it's nuclear, renewable, cement, heavy industries. Lots of initiatives, and of course lots to talk about whether those initiatives turn into action. But if you just stand back and say, so what does that do for business? These are primary drivers of demand and big influences and signals on the way in which business has to evolve. And so, are people sitting in boardrooms discussing the output of COP? Well, probably not beyond the fossil fuel economy, but will it have an impact over time in the way in which consumer demand evolves? What legislation is going to impact businesses? What are the needs that business provides? Then it's pretty clear that the trajectory is pointing us in a direction away from the fossil fuel economy. And those, of course, an awful lot of the discourse around business sees all of this as a negative. It's taking business opportunity away, and I really try to resist thinking about this. These are enormous opportunities. There's opportunities in mitigation. There's opportunities in adaptation and resilience, and there's opportunities through innovation and new markets and new products in all of these areas that are being highlighted in COP. And so businesses should be and are alive to that, and that affects capital allocation, it affects investment capital. One of the big missing pieces, to turn to the second part of the question from Pedro, what still requires more attention. COP operates primarily, in the sort of big picture sense, at the sort of state actor. It's a sort of geopolitical conference. There's lots of policy and good intention. There isn't really yet a clear concept of what the role of private capital is. And there isn't enough money in the public purse or philanthropy or civil society to pay for all the things that need to be paid for. So the only other place that money can come from is private capital. That's business, primarily business or investment capital. And so, in terms of marking the homework, what needs more effort is working out where that money comes and how it plays a role. And in some of the discussions at COP, Mariana Mazzucato from this institution, and Maureen Motley from the Bermuda Initiative, both said there's no shortage of money. It's just a question of how the money is directed. And so, COP kicked the can down the road somewhat on finance generally, and in a sense, notwithstanding the positive developments in some of these areas, it was a sort of an interim COP, because the next COP in Baku will have to focus on finance, and then next year, having had the global stocktake in Brazil, there's going to have to be refined NDCs, having regard to the global stocktake. So that's where the action really needs to be. But I would say really got to try and find a way to engage business more directly in the outputs of the decision.
Alex, would you like to?
Thanks, Pedro. And thanks very much for inviting me to this panel. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to very much echo those comments, Jeff. For me, the single most relevant, important development from COP was the growing sense, I think, that reform of the international financial architecture is absolutely needed, and that funds delivered through the UN funding system from richer countries to poorer countries for their adaptation, loss and damage needs may not be enough. It's obviously great that the loss and damage fund was operationalized, that 660 million odd, I think, was pledged, but our view is very much obviously that that's a drop in the ocean in terms of the amount of financing that's needed. I think the independent high-level expert group on climate finance, what a name, released a report pre-COP that suggested that about 2.4 trillion in investment a year is needed for emerging economies to deal with climate change. And so I absolutely agree with what Jeff said, that we need to bring private capital to the table in a much bigger way. And some of the best actors that are able to do that are the MDBs. And so, because they can obviously crowd in private capital, they can de-risk transactions. And so I was encouraged to see developments such as a declaration that the global stocktake said that MDBs and other financial institutions need to scale up their funding for climate action. They continued the momentum that actors like Emmanuel Macron in the middle of last year were trying to kickstart with his own conference. I was encouraged to see a group of MDBs, about 8 of them, launching this task force called the Credit Enhancement of Sustainability Linked Sovereign Financing for Nature and Climate. You can make these up, these names. Whose the aim of which is to enhance the creditability of emerging nations for sustainability linked finance, a kind of sustainable finance. And in doing so, they want to bring in the private insurance sector to potentially write guarantees behind the debt that would be issued to these countries. So that's a direct example of MDB stepping up and trying to bring in the private sector to increase the scale of climate financing going towards emerging economies. So I really think, for me, that's the key development. And I absolutely echo what Mariana Mazzucato said, that there's plenty of finance. It just needs to be better directed. There's not a finance gap. There's a policy gap. There's a regulatory gap. And so I don't know how long I've taken, but I would, particularly because Jeff has said many things I want to say, I'll stop there.
Great. Nathan, would you like to come in? And hopefully you can hear us.
Sure, hopefully you can hear me.
Yes.
Please note it. Yeah, I see notes. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm sorry that I can't join you in person. It happens that I'm sick. It would have been quite unfortunate that I come and disperse my germs everywhere. But now let's turn to climate finance, a more interesting topic. I quite agree with what has been said. I think I'm more perhaps downbeat that previous comments, as in COP28 hasn't seen major developments. All major agreements on climate finance have been postponed to Baku. There hasn't been any real progress there. And that's a shame, because this is really, for those of you who have read the Paris Agreement, you may know that it is the third objective of the Paris Agreement, alongside climate change mitigation and adaptation, that we make financial flows consistent with pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And we are nowhere near agreeing on the path to go there. So that's I think a big issue. Yes, there is movement on MDBs and international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. A lot of chatter, but not much movement yet. So as I think Jeff said, it's very much a transition COP, and I hope that we'll see more movements there. Perhaps in the next steps, what I noticed, and I think a lot of people have noticed, and it's quite a good wake-up call, even though it needs to be translated now into policy, is President Macron's call for dual interest rates. It's a speech he gave at the COP, and what he said is basically that right now the rising interest rates decided by central banks all over the world is hindering the transition, is suffocating to some extent investments in renewable energy and other transition industries that we need. And so we need to think about trying to decouple perhaps interest rates, or at least to think more about what kind of policies we should have for supporting the transition, not hindering it.
Great, thank you very much, Nathan. It's interesting to start seeing some similarities between what's being said. I think the role of narratives and how COP helps to push cannot be underappreciated. And even Macron's movements, similar discussions that are happening in the Bank for International Settlements in the context of how we treat capital requirements for banks also are potentially positive developments that might have very, very big repercussions. I'll just mention very quickly as well, role of private sector, definitely, I think, on everybody's minds. But potentially one of the events at COP that was very helpful and that wasn't happening at COP were the discussions about the replenishment of the World Bank arm that deals with non-concessional funding, so the IDA. Because especially for low-income countries, that's potentially where they're going to be able to finance the transition. So huge, important discussions there. And for the first time, I think in a while, the president was there to try to show how important that aspect of the discussion also is. So it's good stalemates, but also good developments at the international level. So we started at the international level, and we're already getting a sense of how the national level matters in terms of implementing all of that and getting finance, both public, private, de-risking, anything in between, to the right place, and money out of the places that we don't want money to be anymore. So for the second round, we're focusing on developments at the national level. We know that a significant portion of what we're discussing in terms of ambitions, commitments, comes down to those policies and to reforms that are happening at the national levels. So how do you see the landscapes your work focuses on, and what developments can be crucial to move those ambitions that we have in international level at the speeds and in the direction that we want? And here maybe we can start with Jeff.
Sure. I think the way in which the update on the NDCs has been sort of framed in Dubai, I'm choosing. we have to make a choice how we answer these questions. Do we do them positively or do them with despair? And I've gone for the former. Okay, so I can also do the despair, but on another occasion if you want. I'm hopeful that the way in which the NDC update has been formulated will actually operate as a useful accountability mechanism. We have the global stocktake, which showed that we were not on track, far from being on track. Everyone needs to update and produce drafts of those updates quite early in 2025, actually, so not that long away. And so the scrutiny of the world will be on those updated NDCs, and if they're not properly taking into account the lack of progress, there's going to be a riot about that. So I think a lot turns on that process, but we have to remember that the UAE consensus was the result of an agreement of all countries at COP. So they've all signed up to that. They're all putting themselves in the position of being scrutinised for delivery on that. And there is a huge need, and this is one of the sort of big gaps in the political or the constitutional infrastructure around this, for countries to follow through and implement policies that give effect to that, give effect to their statements, the statements of aspiration. And I think it's unhelpful in a way that there are so many significant elections this year. We can't avoid the fact that poses the possibility of momentum being disrupted. That's true in the UK. It's also true in the US in a very critical way in the US. I think here in the UK, if there is a change of government, that might actually increase momentum. At the UK level, there is a sort of an allergy to actually dealing with these issues head on at the moment. The Climate Change Committee actually did muster a few words of praise for the UK role in Dubai, against which, of course, there is very mixed messaging about fossil fuel exploitation. And so it's a complicated picture, I think. But I think I would say, again, an area that needs significant work is this translation of the high-level objectives of COP to national policies. And we're beyond, in my view, the era where we can look to disclosure and transparency as providing solutions. That sort of model of, if we show people what's really going on, people can allocate, or investors can allocate capital to good things and away from bad. That hasn't worked in the absence of meaningful mechanisms to price carbon. And I think we need to see much greater interventionist regulation from governments. Actually, we sort of need to ban stuff, don't we? Or encourage. And there's some early signs of that in the UK, things like the zero emissions vehicle mandate, heat pump mandate. These are sort of activity level regulatory mechanisms which actually shape markets. And I think we're at the stage where that's how governments need to, certainly in the developed world, where there are developed markets, they need to be willing to intervene. That ain't going to happen in this country with the current government. But there's hope that may change. So look, just to sum up, I think a lot turns on the NDCs. The other issue that on a UK level, the government here remains determined that London should be the world centre for the voluntary carbon markets. Obviously, Article 6 got kicked into the long grass again at Dubai, there is activity under Article 6 regardless of agreement having been reached there. And there are positive developments in the voluntary carbon market outside of the COP process. But obviously the voluntary carbon markets, however controversial they are, and that's the subject of another panel another time, it's still one of the best potentials for getting climate finance to the right place if the questions about integrity can be dealt with. And I think there are signs that those things are being moved in the right direction.
Great. We have many ideas for future events, which is always great as well. Alex, would you?
Yeah, thanks, Pedro. You very kindly introduced me, Pedro, as launching the Transition Finance Student Research Clinic tomorrow, so the audience might not be surprised to hear that I'm going to speak a bit about transition finance, which for those of you that don't know is finance which is targeted at carbon-intensive, high-emitting companies, sectors and sovereigns. And it can be contrasted with green finance, which is predominantly for low or zero emitting activities. And I think transition finance instruments can play a valuable role in the transition for at least two reasons. The first is that they're inclusive, they're focused on carbon intensive sectors. Ravi Menon, the chair of the Network for Greening the Financial System, has said, about 8% of economic activity at the moment is eligible for green financing. So what about the other 92%? We need a different kind of financial instrument or instruments to accelerate the transition. And what I think is really interesting about transition finance instruments is that early conceptions of the concept have suggested a restriction on the use of transition finance labels to corporate sovereigns that are engaging on a credible Paris-aligned transition plan. And so through the use of these instruments, if there's that threshold condition, you can end up in a place where financial markets are actually not just facilitating, but actually incentivizing the transition, which I think is a really valuable thing. The problem, unfortunately, is that these markets are increasingly, at least in our view, associated with greenwashing, what we call transition washing. There's increasing evidence that investors are backing away from these markets. There was an article I saw the other day from an investor online which said, when we see a sustainability-linked bond, our first question is, what are these guys hiding? And for those of you that are following events in Japan, which has developed an entire policy framework, an entire stimulus program around the concept of the transition bond, you have investors, again, shying away, or at least international investors shying away, because Japan is promoting technologies that could be perceived as contributing to carbon lock-in, not least ammonia co-firing with coal power plants, hydrogen co-firing with gas power plants. So I think what we need at the national level in lots of places is a legal framework around transition finance, and that's what Climate Earth's workstream on this is trying to do. I think I agree with Jeff, we need to move way past disclosure, and we need active regulation on this concept, because left to their own devices, it's quite clear that corporates are incentivized to make transition pledges but not follow through. And Oxford have done some research showing quite credibly why. That's because there are some investors now that value climate leaders at a premium, and there are some that just don't care. So there's an incentive for companies to make climate pledges which are free and easy, but not incur the money or face the risks involved in actually following through. There's an incentive baked in, arguably, to transition wash. That's certainly what I would say. And then how do we meet that? Well, from our perspective, we need to meet that with regulation, with a legal framework, and that's what we're trying to do. So that's one thing I definitely think we need, Pedro.
Great, Nathan.
Sure. Sorry, I fully agree with the comments that are made. On the fact that we need more interventionist regulation, that disclosure regulation isn't the panacea, and that it's run off its course. I take a non-UK perspective, if you allow me. I'm not a UK citizen nor established in the UK. And what I see from where I live in the European Union is that we've been betting it all on interventionist regulation to a very large extent. Perhaps to a lesser extent on financial regulation, and that's something we can discuss, but the Fit for 55 EU Green Deal has been a massive regulatory overhaul from the carbon markets, the ETS, to energy efficiency, renewable energy, etc., etc. And and what we see right now in the European Union is still a political backlash growing, animated by certain political faction, conservative political faction mainly, but nonetheless a backlash that is threatening a little bit of progress the course that we set. And that's why I am more increasingly careful when we talk about interventionist regulation, because businesses see it as a burden and feel it as a burden. Most of them can perhaps suffer that burden, but still a lot of them, SMEs partly, it's more difficult. And there are other constituencies, like for instance farmers, which are also facing difficulties. And it goes down to the idea of just transition that most of you are familiar with, which was a core theme of the Glasgow COP a couple of years ago. And I think the best way perhaps to tackle this just transition is to do more than just interventionist regulation, but to invest, to have the state as an investor, not just as a regulator. And that's what we've seen to some extent in the United States. With the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think this is quite a successful recipe, which is hard to implement in these days because right now we're entering also a phase of austerity, and with interest rates, the margins are smaller. But investing, massive public investments can also not only spur private investment, but also bring us much closer to where we need to be without so much backlash as we could face with interventionist regulation.
Bessie?
Yes, thank you, Pedro. I agree that the point that was made that states need to invest, and I also agree with what was said before that there is not a lack of funding. There is not a funding gap as such. But from our perspective, there are also not sufficient green investable projects, commercial, attracting the private sector, or even projects in where MDBs would invest. So what's the role of state or national governments in this respect? In addition to national policies, and of course not falling into the trap of over-regulating the market, because what happens then is companies are struggling and they engaged in a box-ticking exercise rather than really thinking about this transition as an opportunity to innovate, as an opportunity to be ahead of their competitors, really a business opportunities in which they could look at it more from not short-term perspective, but more mid and long-term perspective. But in order for this to happen, all the pieces needs to fall in place. So you need to have the multilateral development banks investing and de-risking projects. You need to have the push from the regulator as well for more disclosure, subtle, regulatory as well signals, but also the state, I think, coming in with policy signals that there are certain deadlines for phasing out of fossil fuels or investing more in nature, and how this all will come together as part of the national policies. So even though we're very small in size and operate in emerging and frontier economies where it's really difficult to have some of those discussions, especially in the current political climate, where some of the developed countries are definitely not walking the talk. Because we also focus on the private sector, and one of the large investors in many of the countries where we operate, we have started developing, we call it country platforms. So these are platforms where we mobilize other donors and private sector investors. We work with the policymakers for them to commit to certain targets, and we come in as a community of investors and also donor funding, concessional finance, get this zone of comfort, or it's an updated version of public-private partnerships, if I can, but really more with the climate environmental perspectives in mind. It takes a lot of work. It takes really a lot of years of coordination. The first such in-country platform we launched in 2022 in Egypt. So this was with close to 8 development partners, the United States, Germany, and we are the designers of the platform. So the initiative confirmed support by the government for just transition, and just transition and network investment for renewable energy. So looking at a long-term perspective attractive to the private sector. The NUEFI, as we call it, also is focused on bringing in the nexus between energy, water, waste in a period up to 2030. So the government committed to retire 5 gigawatts of fossil fuel capacity, and to facilitate the investment by the private sector of at least 10 gigawatts of solar and wind energy by 2028. So we, as an MDB, we guaranteed mobilization of private sector finance up to $1 billion US. But the last year's actually commitments or interests, considering the capacity and the possibilities for development, come close to $10 billion US by 2028, which is a huge figure. And so this was a very innovative platform in a big market with a lot of potential, with 8, as I mentioned, development partners. At the last year COP, we brought in also the IFC, the World Bank, the EIB, for a much smaller country, a different context, North Macedonia, where the context is different. It's like, I would say, less, so it's less important, I would say, the phasing out and such a near target 2028, but more it's about the just transition. How do you support these communities? And how do you support it also from the private sector kind of angle, right? Not necessarily only from public money, but how can you work with the future businesses, or the current, or the businesses that are willing to innovate in order to retain the workers, to retrain them, and to ensure that these communities continue existing. So with this platform, because there was already a successful work in progress in Egypt, but a successful commitment by a number of donors, the government committed at the COP to phase out fossil fuels by certain target dates, to develop 1.7 gigawatts of renewable energy, to de-risk, to provide all this bit of comfort for private sector investors. So this is, I think, there are not many cases like that, but that's, I think, what you also alluded to, the public sector to come in, the public multilateral or IFIs to come in to ensure opportunities for investment and to develop those projects, because we, actually, there are sectors where it's very difficult to invest, like adaptation, nature, biodiversity. It's a big theme, but we have a team of people looking to invest, looking to develop the projects. But even before starting developing the projects, we need to look at the policy enabling mechanisms, at the legal frameworks, at much broader kind of considerations. So so it's not easy.
It's interesting that, again, I think we have some running themes. Jeff characterized the COP as in a bit of a transition moment for finance, and we're probably in a transition moment for domestic frameworks as well, for the MDBs, where we deployed a bunch of new instruments. We're already seeing that some of them didn't really cause the impacts we wanted. Disclosure is a good example there, I think. We're getting to grips to, Inflation Act in the US, I think a great example that we're starting to appreciate the actual impacts. And especially in the MDB space as well, I think we're getting now a bit to the results space in terms of what has worked, what didn't work, and what we potentially need to replicate as well. In the EU, Nathan, I think, covered quite well, but we have a flurry of new pieces of legislation now coming into force. that have been watered down over the last few years, but still we're going to see their actual results, their actual enforcements over the next few years, which should be quite interesting as well. So already entered a bit, I think, into the discussion of round 3, which was a bit about what has been especially hard to get right. I think with what Vessi mentioned now, one aspect, coming from a more finance background, I have often grappled with is how you bring expertise from different areas, how you bring many more experts from many more areas than we're used to, or than we were used to. So what are some issues that we had, we're having a particularly hard time to get right? And whether there are other sort of, good practices, good templates that in your experience have worked particularly well to try to deal with the challenges that we have been discussing so far. I think I'll start with Nathan so he can, probably go to bed and get better from.
No worries. A few more minutes. I think the point that I also take from the conversation is that markets are not going to solve market failures. We've had this very great enthusiasm for ESG over the past years, ESG funds, and BlackRock stepping in as a sort of savior of humanity, taking finally a stewardship for climate change and other issues. And what we see now is that, of course, this is a different moment, a moment of financial restraint, of austerity, of some extent debt crisis for a large part of the world, and so there are other concerns that are prevailing, and what we see is outflows in ESG funds, BlackRock backing down, many other institutes, also because of political controversies. And so I think we should really think what does this third objective of the Paris Agreement entail? It entails 21st century financial policies and regulation. It entails to rethink the purpose of the financial system itself, not marginal accommodations, not just regulations here and there that can make things a little bit better, but really truly change our financial system, the way it's working, its purpose. And I think for that, we have here and there experimentations which we can use, and ideas such as I mentioned at the beginning, different sort of monetary policy that can better support a transition, but also more hands-in banking supervision. We've had the Bank of England was in the 2010s, second half of the 2010s, leading the pack on climate risk supervision, and now it has almost disappeared, leading the way to others like the European Central Bank. We need to have it all, not just one or two policies here and there, but have a whole set of intervention, purposeful intervention to support the transition from central banks, from governments, from MDBs, from IFIs, all of them.
Great. Alex, I think I'll pass you the torch because I think it ties quite nicely to what you've been saying.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much, Pedro. Yes, I would agree with Nathan entirely. In terms of issues, there's been a lot of focus in and around COP around climate financing from richer nations to poorer nations, but there's definitely a lack of discussion around how financial systems need to be completely reworked to bake in environmental and climate, what are called externalities, i.e. the impacts of the real economy and of financial flows to the real economy on climate change. It was encouraging to see some reference in the global stocktake text to systems change. It was encouraging to see a reference to the need to raise revenues from more progressive taxation systems. But the simple fact is that I think $5.5 trillion has flowed to fossil fuels since Paris from the world's 60 largest banks. I mean, that speaks volumes about the scale of shift needed. And COP could be a great breeding ground for discussion of what policies will work, because obviously it's going to take a long time to get this right. Disclosure clearly has been a bit of a red herring. And so the discussion has been sidetracked, and probably there are reasons for that I won't go into now, but the discussion's been sidetracked for a long time. And we need to be thinking very clearly about what kinds of legal and regulatory reform are going to change the culture of the financial system and change the very roots of our capitalist system, which might sound bold to say, and I appreciate I'm being recorded, but I really do believe that. So what do I think? You asked for a ray of light. I've been very encouraged by in recent years of the development of a human rights law, human rights norms, the emergence in Europe of due diligence legislation, because it allows human rights norms, the connection between climate impact and human rights law to basically guide what should and should not be financed in accordance with the Paris transition. So, for example, we at Client Earth a few years ago made a complaint to the UN about the activities of Saudi Aramco, its fossil fuel expansionism, arguing that those activities are a breach of international human rights law, soft law, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And the complaint also named 10 of the major banks standing behind Saudi Aramco. And in August of this year and June of this year, the UN's human rights experts wrote to those entities and said, yeah, we are very concerned about financing for fossil fuels full stop, and in particular, fossil fuel expansion. What are you doing about this? And that's a great example of almost a canary in the coal mine of what courts and regulation and law can do. It can link up potentially with taxonomies and the arc of emissions reduction for different activities, and it can put some from binding law and binding force behind it. Without that marriage, I think we're nowhere. If we continue to leave the market to deal by itself with the world's largest market failure ever, we're going to get nowhere. In that regard, I agree completely with Nathan. So, but yeah, I'll stop there.
So, on a very similar note, we should retelling the story about what's happening at the EU level. CSDDD took finance out of the obligations, which is.
But another example of the issues with the culture, like the financial sector lobbied massively against inclusion in that system. And if all these same financial institutions proclaim to be keen advocates, keen followers of international human rights law, but yet, when legislation comes in that would actually require it, suddenly the lobbying goes the other way. And that says a lot about the culture of the system that we need to address if we're going to get anywhere.
Vessi?
Thank you, Pedro. I agree, but at the same time, you cannot kind of put too much pressure on the financial industries because you also have to focus on the real economy. So you cannot, no CEO in their right mind, right, will implement certain targets or, as I said, like investment objectives when there is no market, when the real economy is not transitioning fast enough. So I agree, and I also think that from our experience, we have now a consistent approach in working with financial institutions and with corporates. As I mentioned, beyond the use of proceeds or where our investment is going, but really helping the client to prepare their climate action or transition plan or climate strategy, whatever you name it, but to start looking at it from risk or compliance side, but more importantly as a business opportunity. How do you translate? Well, how do you measure something that it's all not ingrained yet in the institution, right? So I think what we started 2-3 years ago is first raising capacity, right? In awareness raising within clients and saying, well, this will come, your investors will start asking, or if it's a real economy, right? There will be regulators coming in. So we start working now together on understanding what are your climate risks, what are your climate opportunities, how do you manage, what are the relevant functions. So really looking at what TCFD did in the past, but taking it more for emerging markets, starting from level 1, right? So what is your governance? What are your functions, your processes? Where climate is it an isolated kind of function, sustainability or something? Or actually, are you thinking of bringing it in and informing your decision making and investment? So that's a program that was piloted in 2021, 2022. Now it's very much front and center for EBRD. And we have a similar program for for sector clients, and we look at the challenges for each industry and also for financial institutions. So 2 examples why also regulation is important. 18 months ago, we had a discussion with a large Turkish company. I'm not going to mention the industry, but with let's say in the broader construction real estate industry. And we said, well, we are the only MDBs that if you start working with us, we will ask you to do more than others. We will ask you to start looking at what are your climate targets. If you don't have, let's work for that, for the industry, we will help you with capacity building. We have donor funding for that. And we were actually very, very, very happy that our donors are supporting us in that. But then when we are done in 12 months down the road, you will be a peer, you'll be amongst leading in your peers group and, have better access to products in Europe and services and all that. And so the Turkish company was like, no, the GC came and said, we're not interested. Yeah, it's not a matter of compliance for us. And so we don't want to do anything more that will require us to become, public about our targets. 12 months later, because we continued this discussion, we signed a loan agreement with very ambitious climate targets, sustainability targets. We drafted their climate action plan. We're working with them now, but even more, now the shift has, the dial has shifted, and they offer to support, so basically to fund all this work, but to have this expertise and really they look at it as a business opportunity. They want to learn. They want to excel. So what I want to say here is that, of course, regulation is important, but also awareness raising, working with the sector, and because these are a couple of in a country, you have a few market leaders. You work with the real estate. We create good case studies. And then financial institutions follow, right? Because then they see these investments and they are willing to innovate and have new innovative financial products with us. So it's as I said, it requires progress on multiple fronts at the same time. And what I also wanted to mention disclosure hasn't really done its part. But disclosure, when it is supplemented by SBTI or by regulation, by also what we have seen now with the ISSB coming in, the European sustainability standards, this for us is changing the business substantially. So we are seeing, instead of us knocking on doors or our colleagues on the ground, talking about climate and sustainability, the interest has really peaked, not only in Europe, but in the neighborhood. So I think I want to end on this positive note that we are witnessing really a change. So it's happening.
Great. And Jeff, really quickly, as we're already a bit over time, sorry.
Yeah, this is quite a difficult question. Lots of things are difficult to get right, and there's very few things that have worked really well. So, but I think a creature of COP that I hold a lot of hope for is the sort of transition plan framework, which was sort of launched conceptually at COP26, and has obviously sort of run in parallel to the COP process, but the high-level expert group have contributed to that as well. And I think it works nicely in the CSDD. There, the transition plan is articulated as the way in which a business is contributing to the 1.5 degree outcome. But the transition plan framework, which is out there at the moment, is also quite, contrary to what I said earlier, I think it's a good disclosure mechanism because it really does shine a light on how businesses are transitioning with the presumption that there is a transition.
Yes.
So I think that's more than your average, please tell us how bad your business is, type disclosure regulation. The other thing I'm going to really finish, again, trying to be really positive about COP, and you can believe me or not, but I think one of the things that COP has done this time, better than it has done before, is to illustrate the multidimensional characteristic of the problems that we face. So yes, we haven't made enough progress, but adaptation, resilience, nature, just transition have all been elevated in the narrative in this COP. And of course, that identifying the problem is the first step to trying to solve it.
Great. Okay. Let me once again thank you very much for all, and if you can join me in a round of applause.
Welcome back, everyone, to the second panel on the critically important topic of loss and damage, that is the impacts from climate change that are irreversible, where adaptation is no longer possible. And we're going to be, like the previous panel, taking 3 rounds of questions on these topics. What have been the latest developments in this critically important area? What challenge lay ahead? And how best to address them? So I need to start by thanking our colleague Pedro for giving me the privilege to chair the second panel. I'm Gracia Marin Duran, and I'm here in my capacity of co-director of the Centre for Law and the Environment, together with our Dean, Professor Eloise Scottford. As Eloise said earlier, my job here is very easy because Pedro has done all the intellectual work behind this event. The only difficulty that I have is to keep this brilliant line of experts on the topic of loss and damage, keep them to time. That's my only task here, and introduce them, of course. So I'm going to start with Andrea, who is joining us online, I guess, from Brazil. Correct? No. Yes. Because she's a legal counsel at the Brazilian Development Bank, where she works as lead counsel for the Amazon Fund, yeah, which is a REDD+ mechanism, if I understand correctly. So welcome, Andrea Magalhães. To my right is, that's why I got to chair this panel, because I'm the only one that is able to pronounce her name here at the faculty. Montserrat Madariaga Gomez de Cuenca, yeah, who is one of our lovely PhD researchers here at UCL Laws, working on the relationship between civil society and climate change law and government. But that builds on her previous practical experience, yeah, as a lawyer at the Legal Response International, which is a climate negotiation advisor to the Chilean government, where she's from, yeah, from Chile. So welcome, Monse. I'm not sure I'm going to be 100% pronouncing your name correctly, so please do tell me if that's not correct. Tejas Rao? Yeah. Yes? Yeah. Well, okay. Who's an Adam Smith Fellow at George Mason University and a climate negotiation advisor to the Bangladeshi government, and also a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. Well, welcome. And last but certainly not least, Sarah Hill Smith, an associate at Clyde & Co. Climate Risk and Resilience team, where she's providing legal advice on climate and nature-related risk, liabilities, and opportunities. So as I said, we're going to take 3 rounds of questions, and I will give each of you the opportunity to respond for about 3 to 4 minutes. And notwithstanding me being Spanish, I'm going to try to really stick to these 3 or 4 minutes, not Spanish 3 or 4 minutes. So the first question, as I said, is about the latest developments that we have had in the area of loss and damage at the latest 2 COP27, and in particular COP28. I mean, it's not a new topic, obviously, in the multilateral climate change regime. Loss and damage has been there for quite some years, I think since 2007, since COP13 it was first put on the agenda, but we have had important developments at these 2 COPs, in particular with regards to the loss and damage fund. So I wanted you to share some views on these developments, how far you think we have gone.
So
starting with Montse, yeah.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me. It's an honor, of course, to be in-house. And it's wonderful to see some students as well. So I think taking care of time, I will still say something about the loss and damage fund before explaining what I think about the developments. So basically, loss and damage was recognized as part of as one of the 3 pillars in the climate change regime, only in the Paris Agreement. Before, there were decisions making a reference to it, but it was only recognized as part of the Paris Agreement in 2015. And back then, developed countries in particular, they opposed loss and damage being something where developing countries could then ask for compensation. That was very important. And so the early years of loss and damage saw some progress on a political institution, which is the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism for addressing loss and damage, and then a technical assistance mechanism, which is the Santiago Network. But very little progress was being made in terms of finance for loss and damage because of this context of developed countries saying, no, there's no compensation here. And developing countries, of course, asking for finance to be mobilized towards these severe impacts. And then finally, during COP27, there was an agreement on establishing this loss and damage fund. And they mandated a group of what is called a transitional committee, so parties' representatives, to negotiate how this fund was going to be operationalized. And they discussed this throughout the year leading to COP28. And they came to COP28 with a proposal for COP to accept, and with a proposal of establishing certain aspects of the fund, which was approved in the opening plenary of COP28. So it was a great moment when the COP decided to accept the recommendations from the Transitional Committee. Of course, the Transitional Committee basically has representatives from all the states that the COP has representatives. So it's not a surprise that it was agreed, but it is a surprise that it was done on the first day and without opening the text for a discussion. So very briefly, what do we think about what do we think about the loss and damage fund? Because it's agreed on consensus, it's a delicate balance between some beneficial bits for the developing world and some bits that perhaps we're not too happy about. So basically, one big achievement, I think, for the developing world is eligibility, which countries can apply to this fund, and this will apply to all developing countries. And that's major because most climate finance tends to be a bit more directed towards least developed countries or small island states, and some other developing countries like Chile fear that they will never have access to meaningful resources despite being very vulnerable. Then a second positive aspect, I would say, is the scope. It will cover economic and non-economic losses, which is important as well. And I think Tejas will say something later about that, so I won't say anything more. And then something not too positive is the fact that responsibility from the developed countries is not too strong in the language of the decision, because it urges developed countries to take the lead into mobilizing finance. But if we look at the historical responsibility of the developed countries in the crisis and in losses and damage, it would be best if the language was a bit stronger. And finally, the World Bank as an institution that will run the fund is something that a lot of people are not too happy about, but I will go into that in the second question.
In the second part. Now, Tejas, please keep to 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we will only have round for one question.
Yeah, of course. No, first off, very happy to be here. Thank you very much for hosting us at UCL. Thank you to Pedro for putting such a wonderful lineup together. It's very nice to be among other early career researchers, early career fellows, especially in this second round. And it feels quite momentous that all of us have had the opportunity to engage with the COP, which I think is a real sign of how open negotiations have been to give so many young people an opportunity to engage with the process, albeit recognizing the amount of privilege that gives us the opportunity to actually go there. So I think that's just an outset statement. But to get to the substance of the question, I never knew that a single word could transform itself into becoming a nightmarish word, but the word transition has done just that. Because you've got just transitions, you've got transitioning away, then you have transitional committees, you've got transitional finance, and all of this that just regurgitates in my memory whenever I sleep. And I found that to be a bit of a problem, to be honest. But I think the TC has been very successful. At minimum, the amount that it's done has it's been extremely transparent with its work, and it's been extremely inclusive in the number of stakeholders that it's engaged with. You've had a lot of opportunity to provide input to TC comments, which is not something that you've seen with a lot of TCs earlier. And I think that that's a huge movement that has started really since Paris has taken hold, with the amount of influence that transparency mechanisms especially have had on the community that is involved in these negotiations at large. I also think it was a strategic masterstroke by the presidency to have this announced on the first day. Like Monse said, having it not opened up for discussion, having it agreed by consensus right off the bat, meant that you had at least one successful outcome from the COP right from the get-go that would be celebrated. But more critically, what you saw was, because there was agreement on this text, it started to become used as a political chip for the rest of the COP. Because you had things that developing countries had agreed to or given up, and you had things that developed countries had given to or given up. That meant that the rest of the COP's outcomes had to hedge itself on the compromises that were achieved to make the loss and damage fund operationalized. So there's a huge set of things that were impacted as a result of this fund actually coming to play that I think are worth noting. A lot of this is also the amount of political pressure that it was able to put on the ministerials that took place on day 1 and day 2, where right off the bat, because the fund was operationalized, countries had to pledge money in, which saw a greater stream of money coming in to the fund than would have otherwise taken place. Yes, there are a lot of issues, I think, especially with how the next 5 years pan out. Does the World Bank or does the institution, do all the countries feel that they're getting what they signed up to, or are one of the exit routes going to be taken, is a question that's left open, that the onus is on the bank to actually prove itself to countries, which is not something that's been done as successfully in the past. So it should make for an interesting year. But I do think that it struck quite a healthy balance in terms of setting us up for something that could actually see some form of impact and responsibility without responsibility being used as the word brought to the fore. So I'll conclude my thoughts there.
Thank you very much. Sarah?
Hi, like everyone else, I just want to echo my thanks for being here and thanks for organising such a brilliant lineup. So I'm going to keep it short and sweet and approach it from a slightly different angle, because you've just had amazing interventions from my colleagues. I'm actually going to focus on this question from, look at it from an angle of procedure. So yes, the Loss and Damage Fund was operationalised on day 1 of COP, and it was claimed as one of the great successes, but arguably the UAE presidency didn't really have that much claim to the victory. All the legwork was done in the year between COP27 and COP28 by the Transitional Committee, which met 5 times in extremely contentious circumstances. You know, parties were threatening to walk out of negotiations. There were sticking points that really felt sticky at certain points. So the Transitional Committee is actually the party that deserves the credit for this success, and only because they had a year to work on it and to bring in other stakeholders to make representations and input. And they could hear from the different organisations that were lobbying to host the fund. And when you look at the lack of success, to use that phrase, that took place within the 2 weeks of COP itself, 12 agenda items were Rule 16, which meant they were kicked to the next meeting, which will take place in May and June with a meeting of subsidiary bodies. But that's 12 decisions that weren't reached and 12 agenda items where there's going to be no progress in the next 6 months at least. So it brings up a question that I heard a lot at COP in different contexts. But the question is COP still fit for purpose as in its current format? And a year ago, or maybe it was 2022, but the Club of Rome wrote an open letter to the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, proposing several reforms to the COP process. And I'll pick on one of them because it's highly relevant to what I'm saying about the work of the Transitional Committee. And that is the proposal to do away with the 2-week annual jamboree, I've heard it quoted, in favour of more regular meetings of smaller, focused working groups like the Transitional Committee to come together with specific deliverables that then keep momentum going throughout the year. I'm not saying that that's the right solution, but I'm just posing it more as a question and something to consider, because the Transitional Committee and the success that they were able to achieve is testament to that being a valid approach in some circumstances.
Thank you very much. And Andrea.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm pleased to be here with you. Unfortunately, we couldn't be in person this time, but hopefully next time we'll be with you. But so it's hard to stay to keep the 3-4 minutes. I think Brazilian time it's even harder than the Spanish time, but I'll do my best to keep it. So I'm very optimistic. I think I have a different perspective from Sarah, probably because it's not a procedural one. But I think considering the time constraints, the Transitional Committee made that very important. It could, for instance, detail the structure of some committees, some groups, what demands a lot of a huge ability to balance interests, but it's very good. It also recognized that there are multiple work to do ahead. We all know that, not a big issue, but it points some essential issues that would be out of discussions, just like the conditions of the thing, and it's good for further discussions. So I think the seeds are also welcome. And the third one was inviting participants and stakeholders, civil societies, and others to discuss what they call dialogue, even in the financial structure and financial agreement, but also other parts. It's good to try to avoid some kind of technocracy that could reduce the political influence of those that are not so. That usually don't have the protagonist they would like to have, like those countries that are not members of the group, for instance. But just to highlight one specific point that I know it's controversial, as Rose said, but I think it was a very good point with the indication of World Bank as the interim trustee of the and I think it's a good choice for many reasons. First of all, is the expertise, and everybody knows that they have a lot of instruments to deal with this kind of challenge giving a short answer because of course loss and damage is an urgent issue. So if we have to find a new institution, for instance, we would have upfront costs that could take long, and also rent taking, and the countries could put some kind of spotlight, and it would appear in the efficiency of the program. So I think choosing Multilateral Development Bank that is so big and so solid with country partnership programs, frameworks, co-financing instruments like the CAT-TDO, the either catastrophe deferred down. CAT-TDO, the instrument that is a current line of financing for catastrophe in some countries. There are many instruments already available, and I will have to adapt those for the demands of the loss and damage fund. It was very clear on the draft, but I think we can have a very, very good response in a shorter time than it would happen with any other option. Also giving a specific period of 4 years as a test It's good to give comfort for the members and for such officials about this choice, and also to enforce some kind of commitment of the World Bank with the agenda. And we remember unhappy comments of former President David Malpass about being not a scientist, and he has to deny to be a denier. But I think the World Bank is so huge and so solid that it can, it's much bigger than the presidency or the influence that U.S. president could have nominated the World Bank.
Thank you very much, Andrea. So we now turn to the second question, which is a little bit building up from the point that you all agree that is, I think you all agree that having the fund operational is a big step, is a big achievement. Whose merit it is, how we got there, and so on. There is already some disagreement about among the panelists, but this is good for the further discussion. But you know, it's an important first step, but it's only a first step that it is operational. Now we need to carry on with the implementation, and that obviously brings challenges in terms of assessment, monitoring, evaluation, and other issues. You obviously know more than I do, because you are the experts on this area. So I wanted to ask you if you could share a little bit some insight of what you think are the key challenges, but not yet what are the solutions to those challenges, because that's my next question. Okay? So just the challenges for the moment, not how we address them. Okay? So starting with Tejas? No, Tejas.
Tejas makes me more exotic.
No, exactly.
I'm Tejas.
Tejas.
So, but, thank you very much. So I think one of the questions that I've been grappling with or thinking through a lot over the past year is what is the value of a tree? And I think on a very micro level, this is what the Loss and Damage Fund operationalizing really means. We start to figure out how, as human beings or as an anthropocentric society, we start to examine what the value of nature or what the value of everything around us really is. We're going to start putting money on these things. We're going to start putting monetary value on these things from now onward. And I think a really critical epistemic question to ask ourselves is, what is really this value? Over the past year, thinking about epistemic authority more broadly, I've had the opportunity to engage a lot with with the work of the UNESCO and how they understand cultural heritage. And for me, the answer to these questions can probably be found a lot better in cultural heritage studies and in understanding the way that cultural heritage epistemology has developed overall. Because what you find over there is really an understanding that intangible cultural heritage and inherent values of cultural heritage have to be treated on par with tangible cultural heritage and those kind of questions. And more locally, one of the things that stand out to me from my own childhood is I used to pass this lake on the way to school every day, this lake called Varthur Lake in Bangalore, which caught fire repeatedly about once a week because of the amount of industrial waste that was getting put into the lake. So we used to have this foam come out of the lake and fill our buses every day on a 1-hour bus journey. And that image stands out to me because at the same time that all of this was happening, you had an entire community that used to live around Varthur Lake that was completely displaced and taken away from that lake altogether. And now what you have is that we're trying to figure out an assessment methodology to understand how they valued that lake, how we value these trees, and how we understand the inherent link of ourselves with nature. And there's a huge challenge with that because understanding local communities' perspectives is going to be invaluable to understanding how we measure this value. But I don't think that financial architecture has gone there as yet to make it as inclusive as possible and as consultative as possible, the way that cultural heritage epistemology has. So that I think is a huge challenge that we'll have to address.
Thank you very much. Andrea, I'm back to you.
The challenge, there are so many, but the one that I would highlight was mentioned a lot in the first panel, is financing. So I think this is the big challenge because we celebrate the acceptance of the terms of draft. And of course, big step, but we could fundraise only 400 million. What is, no matter the method we choose decide what would be annual cost of damage. It's not almost irrelevant, but it's a small amount. So, and when you talk about that, it's that sometimes the psychologists donors wait a little bit how things are, and the fund is not operationalized yet. So maybe this is one reason. But as I mentioned, we are in a hush, so we cannot wait to see how we urgent to receive more. And what is even more important, we must be urgent to receive to fundraising in a regular basis. So what kind of financial arrangements we're going to have? Besides the document says loans and grants. Okay, but how are we going to finance it as well? We're talking about donation, public sector, we're talking about aid only. Everybody says that we should attract the private sector as well, but how? This is the big challenge, I think the biggest one that we could point out, because we cannot dispute resource with other funds. And at COP28, at the same time that they pledged to us, to the Loss and Damage Fund, $4 million. They pledged for the Green Climate Fund, I have 3.5 billion for the second replenishment. We know it's a bigger fund about climate change, and also that pledge doesn't mean capitalization. But even like this, there are many others funds like adaptation and Amazon fund also fundraise at the COP28. So we cannot compete, we cannot dispute for this kind of resource. If we're talking about a loss and damage fund, so loss and damage itself has a specific definition, and we should talk about loss and damage finance. And there are many instruments for that. Credits and taxation, and many others. And the difficult, and this is a challenge, is to implement them, to pick one, and to enforce. How is it going to be enforced? It could be like soft regulations, can be because we also don't want to kill the golden balls. So we don't want to make the country that at least now is the government is the only donors we have. We don't want to make them poor because the company decides to transfer the factory to another country that is less committed to environmental issues. So I think financing and really find a source that is predictable. This is the key word, predictable, and on a regular basis is the most important topic to reach now.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Sarah?
Of course. So it's not such a sexy topic, but it's a topic of data. And it's actually embedded in your question. So from my perspective, one of the most significant challenge for the Loss and Damage Fund, particularly in terms of operationalization, is the accurate assessment and attribution of losses and damages. And why is this important? Well, it goes straight to the issue of the equitable and efficient allocation of resources from the fund. So the 760 million that we've had donated, it goes to how that is efficiently and effectively distributed, which in itself is a major challenge considering the variation in losses and damages felt regionally, between different countries, but then also within different countries, and then also within different communities by different representative groups. And this, what I say, comes down to data. So a recent report by the UN called Closing the Climate and Disaster Gap found that there are considerable data gaps in how data related to loss and damage is recorded. And this significantly impacts our ability to prepare for loss and damages and to design effective disaster and risk reduction and adaptation strategies. But then also when a disaster hits, to also accurately measure the impact of that disaster so that the funds distributed, are appropriate. are enough, are specific if you're incorporating non-economic losses as well. And there's various reasons for the lack of data. And one is because a lot of the poor and more climate vulnerable developing nations that will be eligible for funding and support don't actually currently have the resources and the technological capabilities to collect the types of data that we needed. And we need disaggregated data. So looking at all those different nuances and subsets of society who are more likely to be the vulnerable groups are most impacted and therefore, in theory, should be the most eligible under the fund. And then another reason for the data gaps is inconsistency in the disaster or hazard that's recorded. So data is typically more readily available when you look at quite sudden, high impact events like floods and cyclones, because they're quite dramatic and very easy to notice. But there's comparatively little data when you're looking at more protracted climate change related disasters such as drought and heat waves. So, for example, when you look at heat waves, and for comparison, heat waves are a big killer. In 2022 in the UK, I think nearly 3,000 deaths were recorded and attributed to heat waves. So when you look at heat waves, there's the data on that is incredibly uneven and inconsistent. So when you look at the heat waves that were recorded between the year 2000 and 2019, nearly 50% of that data comes from Europe. And we know that Europe isn't the hottest place on Earth. 4% of the data comes from Africa. So we know that the heat waves, we know that they're happening. The data just isn't being recorded. A third reason is the type of impact, loss and damage that's recorded. So human impact, that's loss of life, injury, forced displacement, all losses and damages that impact humans. That's very well recorded. So the study said that of the disasters studied, there was human impact data on 98.7% of cases. By contrast, like Tejas was saying, non-economic data and non-economic losses, it's hard to quantify them in the first instance. So there isn't that data. And finally, a really important one in terms of operationalizing the loss and damage fund is that when data is collected, there's no standardization of the metrics used. So, for example, if you're looking at the closure of a factory, which is an economic loss caused by climate change related disasters, one factory in one country could record the loss in terms of production cycles. My factory was down for 4 production cycles. Another factory could have been impacted by the same weather event, would record their loss in terms of days. And that's a very rudimentary statistic and example. And there's even huge inconsistency in how deaths are recorded. And you think that's quite a binary metric. So there are all of these metrics and databases that are not working together. And this siloed approach to the current collection of data is a real challenge. I know we're not meant to talk about solutions, but I just wanted to say that a solution is in the pipeline. So the United Nations Office for Disaster and Risk Reduction, which is actually the home of the Santiago network that Montse mentioned in her first answer. They are actually developing a model and a disaster tracking tool, which apparently is going to remedy all the challenges that I've just highlighted. So it's not in production, but it's coming. So watch this space.
Thank you very much. And Montse?
Yes, I think that the major challenge here is trust. Trust from developing countries towards developed countries to walk the walk, and also in the World Bank and of course in the allocation of projects. So just as a way of context, when the Transitional Committee was sessioning, they wanted also to agree on a scale of finance, say how much is the fund going to be. And some developed countries, including the UK and Australia, said, no, scale is out of the decision. And it had to be out for an agreement to be reached. So, of course, then now we're hoping that the money is actually put there. And that's something very significant. Then, and Andrea was saying that she sees with good eyes that the World Bank is running this. I disagree, and the NGOs, coalitions that work on loss and damage, they also feel very strongly about this, because basically the World Bank is still funding fossil fuel projects to begin with. Then second, when we look at the experience of the World Bank funding adaptation projects, many times there's been scandals in regards to human rights violations to the communities there. And of course, for loss and damage, that's very sensible, the relationship with the communities. And then also, because they work through intermediaries, it's very difficult that they're going to allocate the small amounts of money to the communities that need this money to cope with the impacts. So it wouldn't serve the purpose of loss and damage projects so well. And in addition to that is, of course, the commission that the World Bank takes for their work. So basically, I think trust and then, of course, the allocation of projects once the fund sets up the board. Hopefully, the board is going to decide on project basis, respecting the agreement to have some sort of fair regional representation and not concentrate all of the projects in just one region or one form of impact.
Thank you very much, Montse, for keeping it so concise.
I owe you.
Much appreciated. Just a second, I have another question, and then I give the floor to the rest. If we still have time, otherwise you can ask your questions over the drinks. But I very much agree with you that it's a problem when we don't have clear. I mean, this has already been the case in climate finance in Paris, where you have these collective commitments without clear numbers. They don't bring anything. Unless you have individual responsibility, not only binding language you must provide. I mean, in Paris, the language is, when it comes to climate finance, is clearly binding, but you have this, who should provide, develop, and who is that? And as long as you have a collective commitment without individual responsibility allocated for that collective commitment, it's very hard to implement it and enforce it. So fully agree with you. Anyway, last question, which is about solutions to all of these challenges that you have said in terms of, generating trust and making sure it's not empty promise, the data and so on. If you could just tell us what you think are the best solutions, or at least where we should be looking for solutions. Is there any other, are there lessons to be learned from any other area within the multilateral climate change regime, or others at the national or international level where we could look for fishful solutions here to some of the challenges that you have identified? And perhaps in your answers, try to think a little bit more of a little bit specifically about the different stakeholders or actors that you have mentioned. So you have spoken about governments in particular, you have referred to local communities at some point in your intervention, the private sector and you financial institutions. If you could also reflect a little bit on these different stakeholders and actors in the implementation and operationalization of this fund. Sarah, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So a question that's been thrown up and brought up in several panels by several interventions today is there's a huge role to play for the private sector and private finance, but the question hasn't been answered. So I'm going to try to do that now, and I'm going to talk about actually the role of pre-arranged financing and insurance. So one of the most impactful ways that I think the loss and damage funding, the initial pledges of 760 million can be invested and put to work is by using the loss and damage fund to invest in premiums, to put in place what's called pre-arranged financing that makes funds immediately available and efficiently dispersed in the event of a disaster that causes loss and damage. So there's lots of forms of pre-arranged financing, contingency funds, contingent loans, standby credit facilities, catastrophe bonds, and many more. But coming from an insurance law firm, it would be remiss for me not to focus on insurance. So I'm going to talk about parametric insurance. So like all insurance, parametric insurance is a risk transfer mechanism that shifts the financial risk and burden of environmental disasters and natural catastrophes away from the people suffering it and their government to the capital risk market. And it's important because the premium is funded, and then when the money is dispersed, you don't actually have to quantify your loss like you do in a traditional insurance policy. So the payout is linked to an objective index. Usually it's some form of metric for measuring weather. I've just been talking so much about data, can't get it out of my head. And when a certain parameter on that index is hit, the payout is automatic. So it means that a lot of the delay that often comes with traditional insurance payouts is obviated, and you don't need to go through that long process. And a study by the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Law that was published during COP actually focused on this topic. And it found that investment in pre-arranged financing using a parametric model have a huge multiplier effect and a huge potential to maximize the loss and damage funding. And they found that for $10 million invested in pure premium, it translates to $200 million in the event of a disaster in terms of coverage. So that's a huge multiplier. And the really brilliant thing about, and going to your point about stakeholders, the brilliant thing about a parametric insurance and the model is that it's super scalable, it's innovative, it's flexible, it can be applied to any circumstance and any form of event that you want to, that would cause loss and damage. So hurricanes, cyclones, floods, droughts, everything like that. So it's very flexible, and it can work at different levels. So on the micro or meso level, an example is a smallholder in sub-Saharan Africa. He's in a drought-prone area. He has parametric insurance that's linked to level of rainfall or moisture in the soil. And you can actually set the parametric trigger to pay out before a drought is formally declared. So the payout is automatic. The policyholder can go and use the funds that are dispersed before the event to purchase excess water, which the farmer can then use to water their crops or water their animals as well. So it actually coming in before the event, it mitigates the loss and damage in the first place and minimizes it. And then you're seeing that model replicated on the international and regional level as well. So there's been 4 regional risk pools set up. One of them is the African Risk Capacity ARC, and it's doing this on a regional basis for countries in the African Union. And it's using customized weather risk modeling to provide parametric insurance for policyholders in Africa. And it's made over 60 million in payouts since its inception in 2014. I have lots more to say, but I'm conscious that I'm probably running over. But it's a very good model of how the private sector can come in.
Keep it a bit for the drinks reception, where we're going soon. So keep all the additional information. I'm sure many would like to hear more. But now I have to go to Montse.
Okay, I will focus on governments, and that's because as with my work with LRI, Legal Response International, I get to find out what various governments are doing at the national level as well, not just in the international negotiations. And also because I participated with Professor Lisa Van Halla from UCL in a comparative study for loss and damage governance at the national level. And that was really interesting because it was empirical and we could look at 12 different countries and see what's happening there. And very much related to what Sarah was saying before about data, one massive finding is that, of course, not having a proper risk atlas or a proper instrument to quantify the losses and damages is a problem, because then the ministries for environment, for example, cannot ask for the ministries of finance to approve a budget into and addressing this. So some countries have managed to develop their own national mechanisms for loss and damage because they think the international regime, of course, is not going to be enough or provide all the answers. And in order to do that, they had to develop this risk atlas at a very detailed fashion in order to be able to quantify and to then get public funds to address these challenges. Another finding, very important finding, is that loss and damages is very multi-level and multi-actor. So countries that are more successful in their policies tend to be very decentralized, and centralism acts actually as a barrier to a proper engagement with loss and damage, because you need to go directly to the communities being affected for them to manage the projects. So those two findings I will share, and I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Montse. Andrea, really 3 minutes each, because we need to leave the room at 8:30. Yes, Andrea?
Yeah, okay, sure. No problem. I'm suspicious about internal policies at national level. So I think, of course, it must involve the countries in decision-making process and give them the protection they want. But I think at the international level, we can create some safeguards or some guidelines or some requirements. And I will explain my perspective. Given a little bit of context, I was a fellow at the World Bank, so that's why I'm optimistic about this choice. And also the Upland Fund, as Professor mentioned, is a RED plus instrument. It means that we are obliged for all the guidance of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, that create a lot of rules and faiths that we have to establish in a national basis. So we have to create a national policy of in RED. We have to establish mechanisms. We have to create a guidance committee, and also methods to make sure that the greenhouse emissions are being reduced annually. So we have so many steps in order to be authorized to fundraise and to get resource credit. So this is a RED plus instrument is a payment for results. So I think this is needed. This is very, very welcome, because in my case in Brazil, we have had some experience with former President Bolsonaro, who tried to cancel the committees and the governance committees, and had to submit this situation to the Supreme Court. And the stakeholders also wrote a letter saying that without the governance, they would have to cancel the contract. The risk would be to ask for the repayment of everything that was already capitalized, and it was 1.5 billion at this time. So we, I would answer here that we should look for answers both in national and international. But in my specific example of what happened with Upland Fund in 2019, and yesterday I was sat on the table discussing a project of law with exactly the same content. They were trying to cancel the committee once again, the same committee. No matter there is already a Supreme Court decision in the opposite side. So the kind of political influence and ideological power that change every election make me suspicious of national and community and the governmental level. Sorry for the time.
No problem. It's nice to have different perspectives. You and Montse are clearly on the... It's a pity you're not here, because it will be very lively drinks reception. But now, closing remark, really 2 minutes.
Yeah,
you have the honor of closing the conversation, but be concise.
I'm also the person keeping them from drinks. So, so 3 solutions, so 3 places where I think we can look for solutions. The person who asked me the question, what is the value for tree, is Professor Dame Diane Coyle from the Bennett Institute for Public Policy. And I think environmental economists and a lot of economists more generally are considering this question and trying to come up with frameworks that go beyond GDP or go beyond absolute economic metrics that measure value of the economy. So the framework that one of the frameworks that we've come up with at the moment is the wealth economy, or the idea that the definition of capital needs to change fundamentally. So I think that's one place to look, and academic projects and academic inquiry is going to be instrumental in finding a solution. The second thing is, I think the Secretariat, the UNFCCC Secretariat, needs to collect a lot more data to leverage the power of the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee. If getting financial flows in accordance with Paris Agreement, in alignment with Paris, is an objective and is an NDC objective, then the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee can take cognizance where parties are not ambitious enough. And I think that that's a tool that the Secretariat and parties should start to lean on, because it's one of the mechanisms available under the agreement itself and is transparent and facilitative to make that happen. And finally, I think that finance itself needs to start mapping itself both from being predictable to actually accounting for real life monitoring through engaging in partnerships with local communities. One of the most successful projects in the recent past has been the SIKU Inuit Hila project in partnership with the universities of the Arctic, which has changed the way that ice cap data modeling is being done to account for real life ice cap melting in comparison to predictable or predictive elements of how ice caps have been changing. And that's changed the amount of funding that's been allocated to them, but also the amount of resilience that the community is being able to build up. So I think these are places that we can look and take away things from. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So I'm sure everyone has a lot of questions, but we have prepared a lovely drinks and food and nibble reception for you to keep on discussing this topic. So I just want everyone to join me in a round of applause for our panelists and for Pedro.